They said when he was born, a thunderbolt split the sky. Now, as he lay dying, the heavens burned with dust and silence. The great Alexander king, conqueror, son of Zeus. In the eyes of his men breathed his final breath in the heart of Babylon. The empire stretched from the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of India, but in that room, it felt smaller than ever. Just a single man, surrounded by shadows that pretended to be friends. Before we dive into the death that changed the world, tell me where. Are you watching from? What time is it where you are? Because what we are about to witness is not just the death of a manite, the death of a god, and the birth of chaos. So, if you're ready, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who loves history, and subscribe to the Hour of War because the story we about to tell is one that echoed through centuries. The heat in Babylon that day was unbearable. Flies buzzed over golden bowls, filled with spoiled fruit. Soldiers and priests crowded the palace courtyard, their faces slick with sweat, whispering rumors like prayers. Some said he'd been poisoned. Others swore it was fever, the vengeance of the gods he'd defied. But no one dared to speak it aloud. That the man who had called himself invincible had finally been claimed by mortality. Inside, Alexander lay upon a marble bed, his eyes half open, staring at the ceiling as if he could still see the stars he had once chased across the world. Around him stood his generals, men who had followed him through deserts and over mountains, men who had killed and bled and conquered at his command. Now, they stood like vultures, waiting for the carcass to still. For 10 days, he drifted between life and death. Some nights he raved in languages no one could understand, half Greek, half divine madness. He called for Hephaestion, his dead companion, as if death itself could be ordered back to his side. He spoke of oceans still unconquered, of lands beyond the sun, and then, sometimes, he fell silent, his breath a faint ghost in the torchlight. On the 11th day, the physicians admitted what everyone already knew. The king would not see another dawn. His generals gathered around his bed. Ptolemy, the clever one, who had always smiled a little too much. Perdiccas, the loyal soldier, whose loyalty would soon turn into ambition. Antipater, the old regent far away in Macedon, waiting for news that would break empires. And others silent, restless, calculating. Who will rule after you? Someone asked. The voice trembled, though it tried not to. The question was a knife. Alexander's lips moved. His voice, once the command of armies, was now barely a whisper. To the strongest, he said. Those 3 words fell like thunder in that quiet room. No name, no heir, only a challenge. A prophecy of blood. The generals stared at one another. None spoke, but each understood. The war that would follow would not be fought for territory or glory. It would be fought for the soul of a dead god. Outside, Babylon held its breath. The soldiers gathered in the courtyards, waiting for orders that would never come. The priests lit torches and sang hymns to appease the gods, though even they knew this was not the will of Olympus. This was the will of men who had forgotten how to live in peace. By midnight, the news had spread through the city. Alexander the Great is dead. The words echoed down every corridor, through every tent and alleyway, carried by mouths that barely dared to speak them. Men wept. Others sharpened their swords. In the stables, the horses stamped and neighed, as if they too could sense that something sacred had ended. In the chamber, the body was still warm when the arguing began. Who would lead? Who would carry the king's body home? Some said the empire must be divided. Others said it must remain whole under a single ruler. But even as they spoke of unity, their hands drifted toward their weapons. Ptolemy was the first to move. He did not speak loudly, nor did he draw a sword. He simply leaned toward Perdiccas and said, "If we cannot serve a god, perhaps it is time to become one." Perdiccas said nothing, but in his heart, something dark began to grow. They dressed Alexander's body in gold and placed a diadem on his brow. The air stank of incense and sweat. The soldiers filed past his bed in silence, each one pressing a hand to their heart, as if to promise that his dream would live on. But dreams are fragile things, and empires are built on bones. As the torches burned low, a sandstorm rose over Babylon. The wind howled through the palace like the breath of the gods themselves, and the torches flickered as if the soul of the king had passed through them. Somewhere in that storm, a priest whispered an omen that the world had been ruled by one man too long, and now it would be ruled by none. The next morning, the fighting began, not with swords, but with whispers, the most dangerous weapons of all. The army demanded a new leader, but the generals could not agree. Some called for Perdiccas to rule as regent. Others said the unborn child of Alexander and Roxana should inherit the throne. The argument spread through the ranks like plague, and by the second day, soldiers were killing one another in the streets. Alexander's body, meant to be taken home to Macedon, was stolen by Ptolemy's men and carried to Egypt, hidden beneath silk and salt. They said it was to protect it, but the truth was simpler. Whoever held the body of the god could claim to hold his spirit. Ptolemy buried him in Alexandria, building a tomb that shone like the Suna city of the dead for a king who had refused to die. Meanwhile, Perdiccas declared himself regent in Babylon, claiming to serve the unborn heir. But the title of regent meant little now. It was a crown without gold, and every man who looked upon it imagined it on his own head. As months passed, the empire began to fracture. From the mountains of Thrace to the deserts of Egypt, governors who had once trembled before Alexander now raised their own banners. Armies that had once marched under one king now turned against one another, each led by a man who believed himself chosen by destiny. In Macedon, Antipater read the reports and smiled grimly. "The lion is dead," he said to his son. "Now, the jackals feast." Perdiccas tried to hold the empire together, but it was like trying to bind water with a rope. The more he pulled, the faster it slipped away. He sent envoys to Ptolemy, demanding the return of Alexander's body. Ptolemy refused. "Let him rest where he will be worshipped," he said. But what he meant was, "Let him rest where I will be king." Perdiccas gathered his armies and marched for Egypt. The river Nile waited for him like a silent judge. His men fought the current and the heat, their armor gleaming like bronze fire under the sun. When they reached the far bank, they were ambushed. The desert became a furnace of screams. Thousands drowned in the river, dragged down by their own armor. The rest fled into the sand. Perdiccas himself was slain by his own officers that night. They crept into his tent and stabbed him as he slept, whispering that they did it for peace. Though everyone knew there would be no peace, his blood was the first of many sacrifices in a war that would last generations. When word reached Babylon, the soldiers said that the gods had cursed them. The empire had been born from divine fire, and now it would die in divine madness. Roxana, now alone with her unborn child, looked out from the palace balcony of the city her husband had built and whispered, "They will kill him for your throne." And she was right. The child would be born into a world of swords and ambition. His father's name would become a curse, his birth a target. The empire that had once united half the known world had become a carcass torn apart by the men who had once called themselves brothers. The gods were silent. The age of conquest was over, but the age of betrayal had just begun. And this was only the first hour of war. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If you found this story as captivating as we did, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss what happens next. Until then, stay curious.
The empire had no master. The world that once trembled under the name of Alexander was a world without direction, a colossus with its head cut off. His generals, who had once stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the sun of Asia, now stood facing one another, suspicion thick as smoke between them. Babylon, the jewel of his empire, had become a nest of ambition. Before we descend into this web of betrayal, tell me, where are you watching from right now? What hour of the night is it in your part of the world? Because the hour we are about to enter is one of treachery and dust. If you haven't already, like this video, share it with a friend who lives for the stories of men who destroyed empires for the sake of crowns. And subscribe to our channel, because what follows is the beginning of a storm that reshaped the ancient world. The body of Alexander lay in Egypt, guarded by Ptolemy like a relic of divine power. His golden sarcophagus gleamed beneath the torches of Alexandria, while across the desert men were already killing one another in his name. The throne in Babylon sat empty, and that emptiness was more dangerous than any sword. Perdiccas, once Alexander's most trusted commander, had assumed the role of regent protector of the unborn king. But in truth, he was no protector. He was a man surrounded by enemies, trying to grasp a throne that could not be held. Around him circled others like wolves: Ptolemy in Egypt, Antipater in Macedon, Antigonus in Asia Minor, Lysimachus in Thrace, and Seleucus in Babylon. They met in what history would call the Partition of Babylon. On parchment, they divided the world as if it were a piece of meat: satrapies, provinces, kingdoms. Each man signed with the same thought burning behind his eyes: this is only the beginning. The soldiers, those who had followed Alexander through fire and death, now looked at their new masters and saw nothing but greed. They had marched for glory. Now they fought for ghosts. We fought for one kinglet. Us not die for none. But his words were drowned beneath the sound of blades. By nightfall, hundreds lay dead. The empire had tasted its first blood since Alexander's passing. When the fighting stopped, Perdiccas made a choice that would haunt him. He declared that both Aridius and the unborn child of Roxana would share the title of king-joint rulers of a single empire. A compromise carved from fear. The soldiers cheered, but in the hearts of the generals, something colder stirred. They had not followed a god to share his throne. They wanted it for themselves. The illusion of unity held for a season. Envoys carried decrees across the empire, gold flowed, temples rose, and soldiers drilled under banners that no longer meant anything. among his people. But everyone knew what he meant. Let him rest under my rule. Perdiccas called it treason. He gathered his armies, Macedonians, hardened by years of conquest, and marched south toward the Nile. It was the first campaign of the wars that would later be called the Diadochi Wars, the Wars of the Successors. The march was a disaster. The desert showed no mercy. Men who had survived India now fell to thirst and heat. When they reached the Nile, Ptolemy's men were waiting. The crossings turned into slaughter. The river, calm and ancient, ran red with the blood of the conqueror's heirs. At night, Perdiccas's officers gathered in secret. They were tired of his arrogance, his madness, his dreams of ruling alone. When dawn came, they entered his tent and killed him in his sleep. His own soldiers dragged his body to the river and threw it to the current. The regent of Alexander was gone. In Egypt, Ptolemy received the news and smiled. He ordered sacrifices to the gods and proclaimed peace, though he knew peace would never come. The death of Perdiccas was not the end, was the first step in a war that would devour the world. Back in Babylon, the army trembled once more. Roxana, now mother to a newborn son, feared for her child's life. She looked out across the empire her husband had built and saw only enemies. "They will come for him," she whispered to her nurse. "They will come for his crown, and they will kill him before he can walk." In Macedon, Antipater received the same news and laughed softly. "The empire has no master," he said to Cassander, "only wolves pretending to be kings." And so it began the slow unraveling of the greatest empire the world had ever known. The men who had once sworn their lives to Alexander now swore oaths to no one but ambition. The lands he had conquered would burn, his cities would fall, and the golden age of unity would fade into legend. The death of Alexander had been the end of one world. The wars of his generals would be the beginning of another. And as the fires spread across Asia and the Mediterranean, one truth became clear: the gods were silent, and men had taken their place. Thank you for joining us. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for the next chapter in this epic saga. We'll see you then. Hey everyone, welcome back. The dust of Babylon had barely settled when the drums of war began to beat again. Across the vast empire that Alexander had carved, men who had once sworn loyalty to his singular vision now gathered armies to tear it all down. The gods were silent, and the world was left in the hands of men who thought themselves divine. This was the dawn of the first great war among the generals, the War of the Successors, a storm that would rage for decades. Before we dive into this epic conflict, I'm curious, where are you all watching from right now? What time is it in your corner of the world? Drop a comment below, because the war we're about to witness wasn't fought for land or for people. It was fought for legacy, for pride, for the immense shadow of a dead god. If you haven't already, hit that like button, share this with a friend who loves stories carved in blood and dust, and subscribe to the channel. The empire may be dead, but believe me, its ghosts still march. It all began in the west, in Macedon, the very birthplace of Alexander himself. Antipater, the old steady regent, had died, leaving behind a fragile peace and a dangerous power vacuum. His son Cassander inherited neither his father's wisdom nor his restraint. Cassander was brilliant but cruel, ambitious but dangerously impatient. He had spent his youth in Alexander's shadow, watching him conquer the world while his own father played servant to the throne. Each sent letters across Greece, promising freedom to the cities that would join their cause. But every single promise was a lie. Athens, Thebes, Corinth, names that once echoed with the glory of philosophy and art now trembled beneath Macedonian boots once again. Cassander, as cunning as a serpent, sent envoys with gold and false promises, turning allies into traitors before a single arrow was loosed. By the time Polyperchon realized what was happening, Cassander already held half of Greece. The old general scrambled to gather what soldiers he could, many of them veterans of the Asian campaigns, and marched south. The banners that once flew beside Alexander S now fluttered in the smoke of a brutal civil war. Athens, proud even in its ruin, became the heart of the conflict. The philosophers who once debated virtue now argued over which tyrant to serve. The city's famous walls, rebuilt after centuries of conquest, became battlegrounds once more. Polyperchons, fleets blockaded the harbors. But Cassander's allies within the city opened the gates in the dead of night. When dawn broke, the fires of the city rose higher than the Parthenon itself. Cassander entered Athens as a conqueror. The people knelt. The philosophers fell silent. He immediately restored the oligarchs to power, those wealthy few who would obey him manned in a final act of defiance. He ordered the statue of Alexander, once adored as a god, to be covered in black cloth. "There will be no gods in my kingdom," he declared. Meanwhile, in the east, far beyond the shores of Greece, another war was brewing. Antigonus, the one-eyed general of Asia, had grown powerful beyond measure. His armies were vast, his gold reserves seemed endless, and his ambition was all-consuming. He ruled a territory stretching from the mountains of Anatolia to the deserts of Syria, and he dreamed of doing what none of the others dared, reuniting Alexander's entire empire under his own name. But one man stood in his way: Eumenes of Cardia. Eumenes wasn't born a noble or a warrior. He had been Alexander's secretary, a man of words and numbers. But the conqueror had trusted him, and through that trust, he had earned the fierce loyalty of men who had once laughed at his non-martial background. Now, with Alexander dead, humans had become the protector of the royal bloodline, fighting for the name of a child king who could not yet speak. When the empire fractured, humans chose his side with care. He stood for the house of Alexander, for the queen Roxana and her infant son, Alexander IV. In his camp, he kept a golden throne draped in royal purple cloth. Every order, every judgment was given in the boy king's name. Even hardened soldiers, men who had seen God's bleed on the battlefield, would bow before that empty throne as if Alexander himself still sat upon it. Antigonus mocked him for it. He hides behind a ghost. He sneered, but he knew the danger. Men fight harder for ghosts than they do for gold. Their war began in the scorching eastern deserts, where armies melted beneath the sun and loyalty was as fleeting as a mirage. For months, the two brilliant generals maneuvered cities, changing hands, governors switching sides, promises bought and broken in the same breath. This was a war not just of swords, but of patience and betrayal. Then came the Battle of Paratocene. The sky that morning was black with dust, the ground trembling under the feet of tens of thousands of soldiers. During the height of the battle, they sold his baggage train, the camp, that held his family and all his worldly treasures, to Antigonus in exchange for their own safety. When the fighting finally ended, Humans was taken alive. They brought him before Antigonus, bound but unbroken. "You fought well," Antigonus said, a hint of respect in his voice. "Swear loyalty to me, and you may yet live." Humans just smiled faintly. "I swore my loyalty to Alexander," he said, "and I will not break that oath for the sake of a thief." Antigonus stared at him for a long, silent moment, then gave the order. That night, Humans was strangled in his 10th, the last truly loyal general of Alexander's bloodline. When word of his death spread, the soldiers wept. Even Antigonus, as hardened as he was, refused to look upon the body. "He died a greater man than I," he muttered, but pity could not stop ambition. By dawn, he was already planning his next conquest. Across the splintering empire, men heard of Eumenes' death and drew their battle lines. Ptolemy fortified Egypt. Cassander tightened his grip on Macedon. Lysimachus gathered his armies in Thrace. And Seleucus, ever the patient serpent, began his quiet rise from Babylon. The empire was no longer an empire. It was a graveyard with crowns buried in the dirt. The gods had left men to their own madness, and they embraced it gladly. The first war of the generals had ended, but only in name. The next one would be even worse, and the child king, Alexander's son, slept unaware in his cradle, while the world tore itself apart in his name. Thanks for joining me on this journey into the past. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter. See you on the next battlefield. Egypt, the land of sun and stone, where the air shimmered with the weight of gods long dead. When Alexander the Great conquered it, the priests hailed him as the son of Ammon, a living god. But now that god was gone, and in his place stood another man not divine, not royal by birth, but something far more dangerous: Ptolemy. He had been one of Alexander's oldest companions, not the strongest, not the boldest, but the cleverest. He had watched as his friend built an empire on blood and belief. And when that empire shattered, Ptolemy knew what the others did not. That power belonged not to the throne, but to the one who could make others believe he deserved it. Before we cross the Nile with him, tell me, where are you watching from right now? What time is it in your part of the world? Because the hour we step into now is one of shadows and cunning, where swords mattered less than whispers. If you haven't already, like this video. Share it with someone who loves stories of ambition carved in gold and dust. And subscribe to the Hour of War, because now we follow the man who turned faith into an empire. Ptolemy had taken Egypt not by chance but by design. When the empire was divided after Alexander's death, he demanded it not because it was rich, but because it was far. Far from Babylon, far from his rivals Antigonus and Cassander, far from the chaos that was devouring the heart of the world. Egypt was isolation and safety, and Ptolemy understood the value of both. But he also understood something else: symbols rule men more than armies do, and no symbol was greater than the body of Alexander. The other generals wanted it buried in Babylon, the center of his empire. Ptolemy wanted it in Egypt, where gods were born and reborn. So he acted under the cover of night. His men intercepted the funeral caravan that carried the king's body westward. The golden casket gleamed even in the darkness, guarded by soldiers who did not yet know they were already dead. When dawn came, the caravan was gone, vanished into the desert. Ptolemy had stolen a god. When the others heard, outrage spread like wildfire. Perdiccas, who called himself regent, declared Ptolemy a traitor. But Ptolemy only smiled and said, "You cannot steal what no one owns." He paraded the sarcophagus through the streets of Memphis. The people threw flowers, and priests chanted blessings. "Behold," he said, "the true resting place of Alexander, the son of Egypt." That was the gambit. By laying Alexander to rest in Egyptian soil, Ptolemy claimed not only the king's memory, but his divinity. The people began to call him Soter the Savior. It was a title he accepted with humility and calculation alike. Perdiccas, furious, gathered his armies and marched south. He swore he would bring back the body and Ptolemy's head beside it. But the Nile had other plans. His soldiers died in the heat, his bridges broke, and the river swallowed his pride. When his own men turned against him, it was Ptolemy who sent word to spare them. "Let them come to me," he said. "Egypt has room for those who have lost their master," and they came. Thousands of soldiers, broken and starving, crossed into Egypt and bent the knee. Ptolemy gave them food, land, and gold. By the time Perdiccas was dead, Egypt had an army stronger than any in the world. Yet Ptolemy did not call himself king. Not yet. He was patient. He watched while the others tore the empire apart. Antigonus raged across Asia, Cassander ruled Macedon with an iron fist, and Seleucus began his quiet rise from Babylon. Each man claimed to fight for Alexander's legacy. Ptolemy fought for Egypt and for the peace that only power can buy. But peace has a price, and it was paid in blood. When Cyrene, a Greek colony on Egypt's western border, rose in rebellion, Ptolemy sent his generals to crush it. They burned the fields, hanged the leaders, and dragged the survivors back in chains. "Egypt must never look weak," he said. Not even for a moment. The priests of Ammon, once wary of the Macedonian conqueror, now called him Pharaoh. He accepted their crowns, stood in their temples, and prayed in a language he barely spoke. Yet the people believed, and belief is a weapon sharper than any sword. Years passed, and Egypt thrived while the rest of the world bled. Ptolemy built ships that ruled the Mediterranean, forts that guarded the desert, and a city, Alexandria, that became the heart of learning and trade. Scholars, traders, and thieves all came to its harbor, drawn by its wealth and wonder. In its libraries, scrolls from every corner of the known world gathered like an ocean of thought. Still, Ptolemy did not forget that he lived in a world of wolves. Antigonus, the one-eyed giant of Asia, began to whisper of conquest again. He had crushed his rivals and now looked westward Egypt. "The empire must be whole," he declared. But everyone knew what he meant. "The empire must be mine." Ptolemy saw it coming. "Antigonus is a man who wants everything," he told his advisers. "That makes him predictable." He sent envoys across the seas to Cassander in Macedon, to Lysimachus in Thrace, to Seleucus in Babylon. "Join me," he said, "and we will stop him before he swallows us all." The alliance was uneasy, built on distrust and necessity, but it worked. For the first time since Alexander's death, the world united not for glory, but for survival. The war that followed would shake the ancient world again. Fleets clashed on the sea, armies marched through deserts and mountains, and for a moment it seemed as though the ghost of Alexander still rode among them, laughing, mocking, watching the empire he built and the friends who destroyed it. Ptolemy, always cautious, always patient, fought with precision. He did not chase victory, he waited for it. When Antigonus tried to invade Egypt, the desert itself became Ptolemy's ally. The invaders' supplies burned in the sun, their men dying of thirst before they even saw the Nile. The few who reached the river found it guarded by walls of stone and fire. They turned back, broken, leaving their dead to the vultures. When the news reached Alexandria, Ptolemy gave no speeches, no celebration. He simply said, "The empire has many masters, but Egypt will never have one again." In that moment, his gambit was complete. He had begun as a thief stealing a corpse in the dark and ended as a god-king ruler of a land untouched by the chaos of the world. But deep inside him, there was one last ambition, not of conquest, but of memory. He began writing a history of Alexander's campaigns, recording the deeds of the man he had followed into eternity. His words would later shape the very myths of the conqueror, casting Alexander as a hero, demigod, and legend. Ptolemy, the survivor, the strategist, became the one who defined what the world remembered. And perhaps that was his greatest victory, not the wars he won, but the story he controlled. The desert night closed around Alexandria, and the torches burned low in the palace. Ptolemy stood on the balcony, gazing across the silent Nile. "I took his body," he whispered, "but it is he who haunts me." Far across the world, other generals plotted their next moves. The war was far from over. The hour of peace was only an illusion, and the gods, if they were watching, must have smiled, for men were playing their game better than they ever had. Thanks for joining us for this chapter of history. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next story. We'll see you in the next hour of war.
The world was tired of kings. Gods had abandoned the thrones of men, and in their place sat monsters made of ambition and fear. The empire of Alexander was gone, scattered into fragments, each ruled by a man who believed himself chosen to wear the dead conqueror's crown. Yet none of them understood that the crown itself was cursed. It carried not power, but the promise of ruin. Before we descend into this blood-soaked chapter of history, pause for a second. Antigonus, the one-eyed, ruled the heart of Asia, vast, rich, and dangerous. Cassander held Macedon and Greece in his iron grip. Ptolemy watched from Egypt, quiet but unyielding. Lysimachus, the soldier king of Thrace, ruled his mountain fortress like a wolf guarding its den. And far in the east, Seleucus had risen from exile to claim Babylon, Persia, and the lands beyond. Each man called himself a king now. No more regents, no more oaths to Alexander's heirs. The dream of one empire was dead. The world was theirs, and they would kill to keep it. The first to test that claim was Antigonus. The old giant had grown old, but not weak. His power stretched from the Aegean Sea to the edge of India. He called himself King of Kings, and he meant it. His son, Demetrius, young, reckless, beautiful, was called the Besieger. Together, they were a storm that threatened to drown the world. When word spread that Antigonus had crowned himself, the others followed suit. Cassander, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Lysimachus, Each one declared himself king, if only to deny the title to Antigonus. The unity that had once built empires now built hatred, and the stage was set for a final, decisive conflict. Antigonus's ambition was simple. He wanted everything. Marched west, conquering Greece, taking city after city. Antigonus, now over 80 years old, stood before his men, his armor gleaming in the sun. "We are the sons of Alexander," he roared, his voice still powerful. "We do not bow to thieves." The soldiers cheered, their hearts still loyal to the dream that had begun decades ago. Then the horns sounded, the ground shook, the battle began. Demetrius charged with the cavalry, his riders screaming like demons. They smashed into the enemy line, scattering ranks like dust.
Because the era we're about to step into is one of cunning and intrigue, a time when a well-placed word could be deadlier than 1,000 swords. If you live for stories of ambition cloaked in patience, you're in the right place. Make sure to hit that like button, share this with a friend, and subscribe to the Hour of War, because this is the tale of the man who built an empire not with fire, but with time. When we think of Alexander the Great's successors, we often picture larger-than-life figures. The bold Ptolemy, the charismatic Antigonus, the ruthless Cassander. Seleucus, by contrast, was just another officer in that vast army, easily overlooked. But he possessed something they all lacked: foresight. He understood that empires aren't just won in battle. They're secured in the chaotic peace that follows. So when Alexander died and the court at Babylon turned into a nest of vipers, with generals screaming for kingship and tearing the empire apart, Seleucus stayed silent. He watched as they destroyed themselves, fighting over a dead man's crown. His patience paid off. When the regent Perdiccas fell, Seleucus quietly rose, taking command of Babylon as its new satrap. It wasn't much, just a single city in a shattered empire. But Babylon was no ordinary city. It was the heart of the ancient world, a crossroads where trade, faith, and knowledge all converged. Seleucus knew that whoever controlled Babylon held the key to rebuilding an empire from the ashes. But his quiet reign was short-lived. Antigonus, the one-eyed giant, a man of immense ambition and military might, marched east. He swept across Asia like a storm, and Seleucus, with his small force, was no match for him. He had to flee, escaping into exile across unforgiving deserts and mountains until he reached the court of Ptolemy in Egypt. For most men, this would have been the end of broken spirit, a cursed fate, but not for Seleucus. He waited. In Egypt, he reportedly told Ptolemy, "Time is a sharper sword than any I have wielded." For years. He served as a trusted advisor in Alexandria, learning the art of patience from the master himself. Ptolemy saw a kindred spirit in Seleucus, not a conqueror driven by glory, but a builder driven by vision. Eventually, Antigonus's ambition grew so large it threatened everyone. Seeing the opportunity, Ptolemy sent Seleucus east again. This time, he wasn't a fugitive running for his life. He was a commander on a mission. He retreated when he had to, struck when he saw an opening, and never ever overreached. His enemies called him a coward for his cautious tactics. His own soldiers called him wise. He was playing the long game, preserving his strength while his enemies exhausted theirs. Finally, the other successors realized they had to unite against the common threat of Antigonus. A great coalition formed: Ptolemy from the south, Cassander from the west, Lysimachus from the north. And from the east, like a shadow emerging from the plains, came Seleucus at the decisive battle of Ipsus. His contribution was legendary. It was his war elephants that shattered the cavalry of Antigonus's brilliant son Demetrius. It was his perfect timing that sealed Antigonus's fate, and when the dust finally settled, Seleucus had gained more than just a victory. He had secured the future. From that day forward, Seleucus was the undisputed master of the East. His domain stretched from Syria to the borders of India, encompassing Babylon, Persia, and Media. He named this vast territory the Seleucid Empire, but he ruled it less as a conqueror and more as a caretaker. He rebuilt ruined cities, restored ancient temples, and brought a fragile peace to lands that had known nothing but war for a generation. But let's not mistake him for a saint. This peace was a cage, carefully constructed of steel and silence, maintained by a firm, unwavering hand. And Seleucus wasn't content just to hold his lands. He wanted them to last. He built an empire meant to endure. He commissioned roads that cut through mountains, connecting his vast realm. He founded dozens of new cities and settled Greek colonists in the east, creating a unique fusion of Hellenistic and local cultures. Chief among these was Antioch, a new capital on the Mediterranean coast, named for his father. Antioch would grow to become one of the greatest cities of the ancient world, a glittering hub of trade, culture, and imperial power. But even as his empire flourished, the man who had been betrayed once never truly trusted again. A man who was once betrayed, he is said to have remarked, learns to see treachery even in smiles. He watched the other kings. He saw Cassander's slow, agonizing death in Macedon, Lysimachus's descent into paranoia, and his old friend Ptolemy aging in Egypt. He knew that time, his greatest ally, would eventually devour them all. And when it did, he planned to be the last king standing. As an old man, his ambition still burned brightly. He marched west one last time into Asia Minor to claim the lands once ruled by Lysimachus. The people there welcomed him as a liberator, a bringer of order. The Greeks hailed him as the true heir to Alexander's glory. He was at the pinnacle of his power, on the verge of reuniting nearly all of Alexander's original empire under his rule. Yet, even then, fate had one final, cruel twist in store. One night, as his army camped near the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Asia from Europe, Seleucus had a dream. In it, Alexander the Great stood before him, young and radiant. "You have done well," Alexander said, "but the world will never belong to one man again." Seleucus awoke with a heavy heart. Just days later, he was dead. He wasn't killed in battle by a rival army, but murdered by an exiled prince he had taken under his wing. Ptolemy Coronos, the treacherous son of his old ally Ptolemy of Egypt. The serpent of the East, the man who had waited his entire life for the perfect moment, was given no more time to wait. When the news reached Babylon, the people wept. He had been more than a ruler. He was a symbol of stability in a world of chaos. In Antioch, they erected statues in his image, serene and tall, a king whose stone eyes seemed to watch over his empire. His dynasty would not last forever. Within a few generations, the Seleucid Empire would begin to crumble, eventually devoured by the rising powers of Rome in the west and Parthia in the east. But his legacy endured. The roads he built, the cities he founded, and the unique blend of Greek and Eastern cultures he fostered would shape the course of history for centuries to come. Seleucus never sought immortality through glorious conquest. He found it through something far more difficult: endurance. While others burned out in a blaze of glory, he became part of the earth itself, silent, patient, and eternal. And so, the reign of the serpent ended not with a thunderous crash, but with a quiet final whisper. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey into the past. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next dive into history. Until next time, the wind in Thrace was not gentle. It howled through the mountains like the voice of an ancient god, tearing across forests, carrying the scent of iron, pine, and blood. In this harsh land, men were forged not by comfort, but by struggle. Among them rose one who would one day be king. His name was Lysimachus, the last of Alexander's generals to carve his own throne from the bones of forgotten lands. Before we step into the world of this hard and silent conqueror, pause for a moment. Tell me, where are you watching from tonight? What hour has brought you here to listen to the story of a man who fought wolves and kings alike? Type it in the comments below. And if you live for tales of ambition and betrayal carved in stone and steel, like, share, and subscribe to the Hour of War. Because now we enter a world colder and crueler than any before it, the world of Thrace. Lysimachus had not been born into power. He was a soldier before he was a general, a follower before he was a leader. When Alexander crossed the Hellespont and began his conquest of Asia, Lysimachus was among those who rode with him, tall, broad, and silent, a man of few words and iron loyalty. Alexander trusted him not for cleverness or charm, but for something rarer: discipline. In Persia, he fought beside the greatest names in history. He had seen empires burn and kings beg for mercy. He watched Alexander stare into the flames of Persepolis, drunk on victory and divinity. But while others dreamed of power, Lysimachus learned something else: that every empire, no matter how vast, needs walls to defend it. When Alexander died and the world fell into chaos, Lysimachus returned to the cold. Wild lands of Thrace, a place the other Greeks considered barbarian, unworthy of civilization. But Lysimachus saw opportunity in desolation. While his former brothers in arms tore each other apart for Babylon, Egypt, and Macedon, he built his kingdom stone by stone. Thrace was not easily tamed. Its people were fierce and proud, its terrain cruel and unforgiving. The winters could break armies, and the tribes obeyed no king. Lysimachus ruled them not with honeyed words, but with the edge of his sword. When they rose against him, he crushed them. When they yielded, he rewarded them. Slowly, painfully, he turned chaos into order. Years passed. The wars of the Diadochi raged on. Antigonus, Ptolemy, Cassander, Seleucus, all rising and falling like waves. But Lysimachus endured. When they fought, he waited. When they weakened, he struck. His army was small, his lands remote, but his discipline made him dangerous. At the Battle of Ipsus, he joined the great alliance that destroyed Antigonus. There, under the storm of elephants and the clash of steel, he proved his worth. When the dust cleared, Thrace was no longer forgotten. Lysimachus had become a king in name and in power. He took Asia Minor for himself, ruling from the old Greek cities, now reborn under his stern command. But kingship is a disease that eats from within. As he aged, Lysimachus grew more suspicious, more ruthless. His court became a nest of vipers. He married Arsinoe, the daughter of Ptolemy, to secure an alliance with Egypt. But there was no love in their union, only ambition. His older sons, born of another wife, began to fear her influence. Arsinoe, cunning and merciless, saw them as threats to her own children's inheritance. Whispers became rumors, rumors became accusations, and accusations became blood. Lysimachus's own son, Agathocles, loyal, brave, and beloved by the people, was accused of treason. The old king, blinded by fear and manipulated by his queen, ordered his execution. The blade fell, and with it the last piece of Lysimachus's soul. The people mourned. His soldiers muttered in anger. His friends turned cold, and in the east a serpent stirred. Seleucus, the patient king, saw his chance. Word spread like wildfire that Lysimachus had murdered his son, and rebellion flared across his lands. Seleucus marched west, calling himself the Avenger of Innocence. The two old kings met near the plains of Corupedium. It was a battle of ghosts. Both men were past their prime, their armies weary from decades of war. Yet pride drove them forward. The trumpet sounded, and the ground shook beneath the feet of men who had once followed Alexander himself. The fight was brutal and short. Lysimachus led from the front, his sword gleaming, his armor dented and stained. He cut through enemy lines like a man possessed, shouting the names of gods he had long since stopped believing in. But fate had already chosen. An arrow struck him in the chest, then another. He fell, clutching the earth he had fought so hard to rule. When the sun set, he was gone. Seleucus stood over his fallen rival's body. Another of Alexander's sons returns to the dust, he whispered. He ordered Lysimachus buried with honor, but the empire of Thrace kingdom built on silence and endurance died with him. In the end, Lysimachus was forgotten, just as he had been at the beginning. His name faded from the records, his cities fell to ruin, and the cold winds reclaimed the mountains. Yet, in that silence, his story lingered, the story of a man who built his world not for glory, but for control, and lost it all to the very order he created. There are those who win by courage, and those who win by cunning. Lysimachus won by will, the will to survive in a world that had no place for him. But even the strongest will bends when the years grow heavy. As the last fires of his empire burned out, the wolves of Thrace returned to the mountains, howling beneath a pale moon. Somewhere in their cries, the ghost of a forgotten king listened, not with sorrow, but with understanding. For he had always known the world remembers only those who die loudly. And Lysimachus, the silent one, had died quietly, like a shadow swallowed by its own night. Thank you for joining us on the Hour of War. If you found yourself lost in the echoes of the past, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss another story from the crucibles of history. Until next time, intro music begins, grand and somber, with a sense of foreboding. The kingdom of Macedon was silent. Its mountains stood cold and eternal, but beneath their shadows the blood of kings still steamed upon the earth. The empire Alexander had carved with his sword was gone divided, torn, and forgotten yet here. In his homeland, the ghosts refused to rest. For Macedon had not been conquered from without. It was devouring itself from within. Before we open the gates of this cursed land, pause for a moment. Tell me, where are you watching from tonight? What hour is it where you are? Because as the sun sets on Macedon, the darkness that rises is older than ambition. If you live for tales of power, betrayal, and madness, like, share, and subscribe. Because tonight we walk the halls where blood and royalty became one. Music shifts, becoming more tense and personal. Cassander was no hero in Alexander's campaigns. He wasn't one of the great generals who marched to India or fought at Issus. He was the son of Antipater, the old regent who had ruled Macedon while Alexander conquered the world. Cassander had grown up in the shadow of legends, and envy had become the fire that kept him alive. When Alexander died, Cassander saw his chance. Macedon was fractured, ruled by queens and children, while the real power lay scattered across the east. He returned home, whispering loyalty, but carrying poison in his heart. His first targets were the last remnants of Alexander's direct line, Roxana, Alexander's widow, the proud Bactrian queen, and their young son, Alexander IV, the last true heir to the throne. They were imprisoned under Cassander's watch in the city of Amphipolis, guarded day and night. For years they lived there, like ghosts in golden cages. Cassander claimed he was protecting them, but Macedon had learnt to fear protectors more than enemies. Whispers spread across the land that the young prince would soon come of age, that his name alone could summon armies. And Cassander knew, as long as Alexander's blood lived, he would never be king. So one night, when the moon hid behind the clouds and the city slept, Cassander gave the order. The guards entered the chamber quietly, carrying ropes instead of swords. Roxana fought like a lioness, but they silenced her cries. Her son, barely 13, did not beg. "Tell him," he said before the rope tightened, "that the blood of Macedon never forgets." When dawn came, the city bells rang not for mourning, but for coronation. Cassander was crowned king of Macedon. Music becomes darker, more atmospheric, but no crown can hide blood forever. The land itself seemed to recoil from him. The farmers said their crops withered early that year. The rivers ran darker. Even the birds avoided the palace. "It is cursed," the priests whispered. "The earth remembers Cassander ruled with an iron hand." He rebuilt cities, founded Thessalonica in honor of his wife, and stamped his name upon the coins of the realm. To the world, he was a restorer of order. But at night, in the silence of his chamber, he heard footsteps, light and slow, and the echo of a boy's voice asking, "Do you remember me?" His mind began to rot under the weight of his own crime. He saw shadows where none stood, faces in polished bronze. His servants found him awake at dawn, staring at the door as if expecting someone. When they asked what troubled him, he said only, "The house of Alexander still stands. I hear it breathing." Madness became his companion. He trusted no one, not even his own blood. He sent his brothers to distant commands, his friends he poisoned at feasts. Each night he washed his hands again and again, though no one could see the stains he saw. "It will not come off," he muttered. "It never will." Years passed, but the curse did not fade. His body began to twist with a strange disease, his flesh swelling, his limbs trembling. The physicians said it was gout. The priests said it was justice. His once handsome face became disfigured, his speech slurred, and his breath stank of rot. Yet still he clung to the throne, unwilling to release his grip on the world he had stolen. When he finally died, they say he screamed, a name not his own. But Alexander's his sons buried him in Pella, beneath marble and gold, but no one mourned. The people whispered prayers, not for his soul, but for their own safety as, if fearing the dead king might rise again. But death did not end his curse. Cassander's sons turned upon one another within months. The eldest, Philip, ruled for just a year before being slain. The next, Alexander V, sought help from a rival, Demetrius, and was betrayed and killed. The house of Cassander, which had begun with murder, ended in murder, and Macedon, once the heart of the world, was left in ruins, its throne empty, its soil soaked in royal blood. The curse of Alexander's line had come full circle. The blood that had conquered the earth now watered its own grave. They say even centuries later, travelers in Amphipolis could hear whispers in the ruins of the old palisade mother's last breath. A child's quiet defiance and the soft creak of a rope swaying in the dark. Cassander thought he could bury the past. But the past does not stay buried, not in Macedon, not in the shadow of a god. For every empire built on blood must one day drown in it. And thus ended the line of the usurper king crowned in silence, cursed by eternity. Thank you for joining me in this tale of ambition and ruin. If you enjoyed this journey into the darkness of history, please hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss our next story. Until next time, stay curious. The world had grown old since the death of Alexander. His empire, once as bright as the sword of Zeus himself, now lay cracked and bleeding. The cities he founded had turned into fortresses, the friends he had trusted had become tyrants, and the dream of unity, that great, shimmering illusion, had become dust. Yet everywhere men still whispered his name. Alexander the Conqueror, the god who died too soon. But the dead god had left behind sons not of blood, but of ambition. Each of them had drunk from the cup of conquest and tasted its poison. Now they would devour each other to claim what remained of his ghost. Before we descend into their war, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? And what hour of the world is it where you sit? Because here, in the 9th hour of war, even time itself seems to bleed. If you've followed this journey from the beginning, thank you. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the Hour of War. For now, we reach the chapter where gods are forgotten and men pretend to be divine. When Cassander's bones turned cold in Macedon, the vultures of empire turned their eyes east again. Lysimachus, the wolf of Thrace, tightened his grip on the lands beyond the Hellespont. Ptolemy, the old fox of Egypt, grew grey and cautious, his son already waiting like a shadow behind him. And in Asia, Seleucus, that towering serpent, stretched his empire from the Mediterranean to the edge of India, where the bones of Alexander's soldiers still glittered in the dust. But there was another Demetrius, the son of Antigonus, the besieger of cities. He was handsome, brave, and cursed by glory. To the common people, he was Alexander reborn. To the kings, he was a threat that could not be ignored. He had inherited his father's fury and his arrogant sound. Like Alexander, he dreamed not of ruling a kingdom, but the world, when his father Antigonus was slain at Ipsus, crushed by the combined armies of his rivals. Demetrius escaped not defeated, but wounded. For years he drifted like a storm across the Aegean, gathering ships, mercenaries, and restless souls who still believed the dream could be revived. He was a god's orphan, and the world was his battlefield. He struck first at Athens, the city that had once worshipped him as a living hero. They opened their gates not out of love, but fear, and Demetrius entered in silence, his armor black, his eyes burning with the memory of a father's death. The priests greeted him with incense. He offered them gold and mercy. But at night he stood on the Acropolis and whispered to the wind, "You forgot me once. You will not forget me again." From there he built his army anew, 1,000 ships, 10,000 blades, and a hunger that could drown empires. His banners bore the sunburst of Macedon, the same that had once flown above Alexander's host. He spoke not of conquest, but of restoration, the return of the empire to its rightful form. And men believed him, for his words carried the weight of prophecy. But destiny is a cruel trickster. As Demetrius prepared to strike at Asia, his enemies united once more: Lysimachus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy, the sons of the dead god's shadow. They met not on open plains, but in secret letters, bound by fear. "If we do not destroy him now," wrote Lysimachus, "he will finish what his father began. He will build the empire again." The war that followed was unlike any before it. Fleets clashed in the night seas of Cyprus, cities burned in Thrace, and the Macedonian heartlands wept under the weight of armies that all claimed to be its saviors. Demetrius won battles but lost allies. His own soldiers began to doubt whether he fought for Macedon or for himself. In the winter of 288 BC, as his forces dwindled, he turned to the east to Seleucus, the old serpent of Babylon. He hoped to rebuild there, to strike back once more. But Seleucus had already decided the age of dreamers was over. When Demetrius arrived, Seleucus greeted him like a brother, with wine and feasts. For months he lived in the splendor of the Eastern court, surrounded by dancers, soldiers, and the scent of foreign perfumes. Yet he was no guest. He was a prisoner draped in silk. Slowly, the truth sank into him. The son of Antigonus, the would-be king of kings, was now a relic, a ghost of Alexander's dream. He spent his last days staring out across the Euphrates, whispering to the horizon, "Father, I see it now. The empire was never meant to live. It was meant to burn." When he died, Seleucus ordered his ashes returned to Greece with full honors. The people of Athens, once his worshippers, received them in silence. No cheers, no tears only, the soft echo of sandals on marble as the urn was placed beside his father's tomb. And so the last son of the dead god was gone. The world had no more Alexanders, no more kings who dreamed of the impossible, only old men and their sons, clinging to fragments of what once was. Yet even then, in the courts of Egypt and Syria, the legend refused to die. Poets still sang of the conqueror's blood, claiming it flowed in this prince or that general. Every man who took the throne whispered the same words in the dark, "I am his heir." But the gods no longer listened. The thunder of Alexander's age had faded to echoes. The swords that once shaped the world were rusting in forgotten graves. The sons of the dead god had devoured each other until nothing remained but stories, shadows, and the ruins of empire. And so, from the burning of cities to the silence of tombs, the prophecy was fulfilled. The world that could not bear one Alexander would never survive 100 lesser men trying to become him. Thank you for joining me in this chapter of our story. If you've been on this journey with us, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. Until we meet again, stay curious. The wind over Babylon carried no banners now. The palaces that once echoed with the footsteps of conquerors had fallen silent. The empire, that shining vision carved by the sword of a single man, was gone. It had burned bright like a star, and, like all stars, it had died in its own fire. Yet the ashes still whispered. Before we walk through them, take a moment. Where are you watching from tonight? What time is it where you sit staring into the past? Because this is not just the end of a story. It's the moment history exhales. If you followed us from the first hour of war, like, share, and subscribe, because tonight we bury the greatest empire ever built by human hands. Alexander's world had vanished, but the echoes of his dream refused to fade. From the Nile to the Indus, from the mountains of Macedon to the deserts of Persia, cities still bore his name: Alexandropolis, Iskandaria. They stood like tombstones, monuments to the man who had thought himself divine. But now no one ruled them all. The great generals, Ptolemy, Seleucus, Lysimachus, were long dead. Their sons had fought, and their sons' sons had been buried beneath their own ambitions. The age of heroes was over. In its place had come an age of crowns, without glory, of kings who ruled palaces, not worlds. In Egypt, the line of Ptolemy still clung to power. Their blood mixed with the blood of pharaohs, their tongues Greek, their hearts hollow. They called themselves gods, but none dared compare to Alexander. The Nile, once a river of conquest, now ran silent under the weight of ritual and decay. In Asia, Seleucus's empire stretched vast but thin, its borders cracking like old marble. The Greeks there lived among Persians and Indians, no longer conquerors, just settlers, lost in time. The glory of conquest had turned into the fatigue of administration, and far to the west, Macedon itself, the birthplace of Alexander, had become a Shadua battlefield for foreign powers, its people weary, its spirit gone. The empire had not fallen in a single battle. It had decayed one betrayal, one death, one ambition at a time. The dream that had united the world had died not by the sword, but by the hunger of men who thought they could inherit eternity. Still, in the ruins of Babylon, a legend endured. Travelers wrote of a tomb, great marble chamber where the conqueror lay, encased in glass, his body untouched by time. Kings came from across the earth to gaze upon him. Julius Caesar wept before his face. Augustus laid flowers at his feet. Even centuries later, conquerors whispered his name before battle, as if invoking a ghost. But the tomb, like the empire, vanished. No one knows where it lies now. Some say it was stolen, others say buried beneath sand and silence. Perhaps it's fitting that the man who wanted to conquer the world found no home in it. And yet, his dream did not die. The borders he broke never truly healed. His armies had carried Greek thought, art, and language across continents, planting seeds that outlived every king who followed. The world became smaller, its people more connected, its empires larger and deadlier. In a way, Alexander's fire still burns in the hearts of every man who looks at the map and thinks, I could rule it all. But his greatest legacy was not conquest. It was the warning he left behind, written in the blood of his heirs, that no empire built on ambition alone can endure. Power, like flame, must consume what feeds it, and in the end, it consumes itself. So, as the sun sets over the ruins of Babylon, imagine the wind moving through those broken columns, whispering through the stones that once knew greatness. Listen closely, you can almost hear it. Not the clash of swords, not the roar of armies, just a single voice, far away, saying, there is nothing left to conquer. And in that silence, history turns the page. The empire of Alexander, the dream of gods and men, was dust. But from that dust, new powers would rise. Rome in the west, Parthia in the east, and far beyond, unseen kingdoms waiting their turn beneath the same sun. Every age believes it is eternal. Every empire thinks its light will never fade. Yet, in the end, they all crumble, and the ashes tell the same story. That greatness is not measured by how far you conquer, but by what remains when your name is gone. And so ends the tale of the man who became a god and the world he left behind. The fire of Macedon has burned out. The hour of war is over. But the echoes of that war will never truly die. So, my friends, this was the complete saga of the fall of Alexander's empire. How did this story make you feel? Let us know your thoughts down in the comments. And tell us, which great war or empire should we bring to life next? Should it be the rise of Rome, the Mongol storm, or perhaps the fall of the Ottomans? Your suggestions shape the hour of war. If you enjoyed this journey through history and power, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, because here on the Hour of War, every battle is a story, and every story opens a new world.